We saw that because the stream and the bitmap implements IDisposable, it can be used together with a using statement or using declaration. This will ensure that the managed and unmanaged resources are cleaned up properly.
Doing so will hopefully avoid unnecessary allocation and what we call a memory leak. Implementing the interface IDisposable is simple. You can do this on any class, and all that it requires is that you implement a public void method called dispose. This method will be called through the using statement or using declaration after it's done. I'd like to introduce a new class in our business layer of the warehouse management system. Its purpose is to load a batch of orders from a local JSON file. Then process each order using the order processor. Let's create the file processor class. It will use the order processor, so it's a good idea to pass this to the constructor. This means the file processor doesn't have to be in charge of creating that instance. When an order that's loaded from disk has been processed, we'd like to handle the result, sort of like reporting on the progress. To do this, the order processor exposes an event called order created. We can subscribe to this and print a message to the console. To initiate the order processing, we'll do that from a method called start. This will read all the text from a file that's included in the project, and then deserialize this into a proper array of orders. We can then iterate through all the orders and process them one by one. Would you say that we are done now? You may already have spotted an issue with this class. We attach an event handler to the event exposed by the order processor. But because we never unsubscribe from that, we'll be left with unnecessary allocations that cannot be cleaned up. One way to solve this would have been to subscribe and unsubscribe in the method start. However, in some cases, this might not be the only method that's relying on the events. This means you'd have to introduce a lot of duplication. That's not an ideal scenario. Instead, we are going to implement IDisposable. This requires the method dispose to be added. In here, we can unsubscribe from all the events and remove any resources that may need to be cleaned up. For example, if you have a stream that's available through the entire class, you could make sure that it's disposed in this method. It's also where you'd clean up allocated unmanaged memory. This pattern allows you to clean up resources when the instance is no longer useful. Visual Studio will not warn you about missing using statements or using declarations. Implementing IDisposable is not a guard against memory leaks. It's just a pattern to follow to allow you to easily have a way of cleaning up resources. We've now ensured that the dispose method unsubscribes from all the events that we subscribe to. This class is no longer tied to the order processor. If we go to the program and create an instance of the file processor in a new method and pass an instance of an order processor into that, we have to make sure that we also introduce a using statement or a using declaration. You can have multiple using statements or using declarations in the same method. When it comes to the using declaration, The dispose method on the IDisposable object will execute when the method completes. When you debug this, you will see that the dispose method executed when the entire method completed. This course does not cover asynchronous or multi-threaded programming. That alone is an entire course itself. I do have a course here on Pluralsight covering this subject, which I highly recommend. While we are talking about disposable, I do think it's worth mentioning that you can also have an asynchronous disposable. If you implement the interface IAsyncDisposable, the dispose async could of course call the normal dispose method inside of it, and then clean up resources that need to perform their operations asynchronously. To use the asynchronous disposable, you append the await keyword in front of the using. What happens if you have multiple using statements for the same variable? Will it execute the dispose method more than once? Give that a try and see what happens. If your dispose method shouldn't be called more than once, and doing so could introduce problems, you need to keep track if it's already been disposed. We've now seen how to properly dispose of an object by following this very simple pattern. Implement IDisposable whenever you need to clean up resources. I cannot stress this enough. Make sure that you always unsubscribe from your events. If the IDisposable doesn't work in your case, you'd have to find something else, such as a method that executes when a view disappears. You cannot use the finalizer to rely on your resources being cleaned up. The finalizer will only be called if the garbage collector determines that it can collect the instance. Let's see what happens if we have a finalizer on the file processor and then force the garbage collector to run and simply print something to the console. When the garbage collector takes care of this instance, we should see something printed in our console. If we remove the using statement, it won't reach the finalizer. And by now, you should know why.
Add a using, which then cleans up the resources. After this, the finalizer should execute. This shows why you can't clean up certain resources in the finalizer. It's time to head on to the final piece of this course and talk about boxing and unboxing.